Hello and welcome to Amazing Stories. Our topic today is Stradivarius, the violin we sings. And this story has a little bit for everyone. If you're into finance, for instance, we've got some finance here. If you're into sports, we got a little bit of sports for you. If you're into history, we've got lots of history for you. So it's not just for the classical violinist. We even have somebody who doesn't like the violin but loves the fiddle. So let's start with that finance portion. How much is a violin worth, a Stradivarius violin worth? Well, in 1990, the Mendelssohn sold in London for $1.7 million. 1998, the Kreutzer sold in London for 1.5, almost 1.6 million. 2005, in an auction at Christie's in New York, the Lady Tennant sold for a little over $2 million. 2006, 1707 hammer sold for $3.5 million at Christie's after only 5 minutes worth of bidding. In 2007, the 1729 Solomon sold for $2.7 million. And this was interesting. It sold to an anonymous bidder. Christie's had estimated the violin to be worth $1 to $1.5 million. It turned out that Christie's, out of this $3.6 million, got more money for auctioning the violin than it was estimated that was worth originally. 2010, the 1697 Molitor sold for $3.6 million by Teresio Auctions. This was the highest record of any musical instrument sold online on auction. In 2011, yes, 1721 Lady Blunt, $15.9 million. It was auctioned by the Nippon Music Foundation. The proceeds went to help the victims of the Japan earthquake at the time. The Nippon Music Foundation owns about a dozen Strads and loans them out. And by the way, the Lady Blunt was named for the granddaughter to Lord Byron, Lady Anne Blunt. She had owned it for about 30 years. Now, another sale was attempted in 2014 of another Strad and went up for auction, but it was given a minimum bid of $45 million, and that auction failed. So we don't know exactly how much that violin may have been worth. Strad's owned by a lot of different people. Besides some of those anonymous, we know some violinists, famous violinists who own Strads. Yo-Yo Ma, the French cellist and violinist, owns a Strad. Julian Lloyd Webber, the British cellist and violinist, and yes, he is the son of Andrew Lloyd Webber. Itzhak Perlman, American Jewish violinist, and here's your sports here. Yes, Itzhak Perlman in this picture is fixing to play the national anthem at Yankee Stadium on his violin. And then Gil Shahan, another famous American Jewish violinist. Also, it's a number of violins are owned by orchestras. The Vienna Philharmonic owns one, as does the Los Angeles Philharmonic. The Los Angeles one is the 1729 Benny. And yes, it was named by Jack Benny and was given to the orchestra by Jack Benny. There are violins on public display: the U.S. Library of Congress, the Agency of National Estates of Spain, the Royal Academy of Music in England, the Musée de la Musique in Paris, and a little-known museum known as the National Music Museum, and it's in Vermilion in South Dakota. And not only does it have a Strad violin, but it has one of 2 known Stradivari guitars and one of 2 known Stradivari choral mandolins. Now, obviously, there have been lots of stories about violins lost and recovered through the years. Here's a few of those to start with. Starting in 1908, the Belgian violinist was on a concert tour in St. Petersburg, Russia. He had 4 Strads with him, and one was stolen from his hotel room, was never recovered. In 1925, 3 violins, the 1711 Earl of Plymouth, the Messiah, the Allard, they were found in a storeroom on the estate of the Earl of Plymouth. 1951, this is an interesting story. A Korean War soldier found the Stradivarius hidden in a wall of a rundown house. They had it appraised and and authenticated as a Stradivarius. In 1967, there was a violin that was owned by the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA Department of Music. And it was either left on top of or inside a member of the Roth String Quartet's car. And it either fell off the top or it was stolen out of the car. Well, it turned out in 1994, the woman turned it in, and she said that it belonged to her ex-husband. It was given to him by an aunt, and she had gotten it in their divorce settings. She said that the aunt found it along the highway. UCLA gave her $11,500 just to avoid the court fight on it. Interesting story. 2008, we got an honest taxi driver here. The owner of a Strad violin left it in the taxi driver turned it in the next day. From 1908 to 2002, there have been 13 Strads stolen. Not all of them, only 4 of them, in fact, have been recovered. One was actually stolen twice. And of course, there's those myths that you might find a violin somewhere, a Strad violin yourself. Maybe it's hidden away in the attic or in the basement, or you might find it at a yard sale down in the next block. Other violins have been destroyed, some in accidents, some lost at sea, some in floods. The firebombing of Dresden in World War II destroyed some of the Strad violins. Copies of violins have been made for 2 centuries, and they bear the Stradivarius label on them. But the label itself, it does not mean that the Strad is authentic. Until 1891, you could put anything you wanted to on the label and make it look like a Stradivarius label. But the McKinley Act of 1891 stopped that to some extent. It required the label to be inscribed, to inscribe the country of origin. The McKinley Tariff Act reads, that on and after the 1st day of March, 1891, all articles of foreign manufacture, such as are usually or ordinarily marked, stamped, branded, or labeled, and all packages containing such or other imported articles shall respectively be plainly marked, stamped, branded, or labeled in legible English words so as to indicate the country of their origin, and unless so marked, stamped, or branded, or labeled, they shall not be admitted to entry. And so there have been hundreds of thousands of copies of Strad made through the years, made in Germany, France, Central and Eastern Europe, England, China, Japan. You know, a lot of these had actually put the name of the country in there. 1957, there were further requirements saying that you had to have the words "copy of" for a copy of the Strad. But obviously, it takes an appraisal of an expert to determine whether a Strad is real or not. And this would be a member of the American Federation of Violin and Bow Makers. So what is a violin anyway? A violin is a stringed instrument that produces sound from vibrating strings, usually with 4 strings tuned in perfect fifths. The violin is the smallest of the violin family. It's the highest pitched member of the violin family as well, which would include the violin, the viola, the cello, and the double bass. And all of these then would be played with a bow. What makes up a violin? Well, parts of the violin are glued together with an animal hide glue. It has a spruce top, and this goes by various names. It's also called the soundboard, the top plate, the table, or the belly. And then the ribs of the violin and the back of the violin are usually made of maple. It has 2 end blocks as well, and these are also usually made of maple. And then it has this dowel-looking thing here, and that's exactly what it is. It's a dowel. It's called a sound post, and it's placed at the treble end, or the higher pitched end of the sound of the bridge, which is, I'll get to that in a minute. But so it's pitched near the side. So it connects the top of the violin with the back of the violin. And this takes the vibration from the top into the back of the violin. And it sort of what enhances the tone, and it also changes the tone. Because if you have a dowel that is larger than this, your tone is going to be different than this in the violin. So it's important to have the exact size of dowel. These are called the sound holes, or the F holes on a violin. Now, if you got a guitar, you got a ukulele, you've got a big sound hole there. But these are very small. I mean, you can see that they're shaped like an F. The purpose of these is not to produce the sound. The purpose of it is to help take the sound and enhance the sound, make the sound a larger sound. So the sound actually emanates, it actually transfers from the bridge to the top of the violin. The sound post then takes it to the back of the violin, and the sound reverberates in the air in the violin, and the air is allowed in and out by the F holes, and so producing a larger sound. There is also what's called the perfing. This is sort of the edging on the violin, and it protects the violin from cracking from around the edge. This is the neck of the violin right here, and on the neck is the fingerboard and the peg box. The peg box obviously is used to tighten and loosen the strings, and so to tune a violin, you would use the peg box, and you would tighten to a certain key, depending upon which string that you're using. And then the fingerboard, you press down the violin strings, and the tighter the string, the farther your finger is up the string, the higher the sound is. The bridge supports the strings, and it's where you take the vibration from the strings, the sounds that the strings are making goes into the bridge, and the bridge is actually what carries the sound then to the soundboard, etc. This is the chin rest. This is known as the tailpiece, and the tailpiece anchors the strings. Now it has 4 strings to it. The strings are made of catgut. Now that doesn't mean that they're made of the intestines of cats. Catgut is made of the intestines of sheep or goats. I don't know why they call it catgut, but they do. Catgut they can be made of purlon, which is a type of nylon, or they can be made of steel as well. And then the bows are strung with horsehair. And they go strung from the tip of the bow, which is not shown here, to the base of the bow. And then this is called a frog. And the frog helps determine, again, the tenseness of the bow. So it helps tighten that up as well. Pitch of a violin, the lowest string is G. So if you're a pianist or singer, you know where middle C is. Middle C is the middle of the piano. And it's sort of the note that says, okay, if you go higher than middle C, you're singing treble. If you go lower, you're singing in the bass clef. Higher than middle C is generally a woman's voice. Lower than middle C is a man's voice. And so the G from middle C, 4 notes down, the G is then the lowest string of the violin. And then you go from fifths. G, A, B, C, D to the next fifth. D, A, B, D, E, F, G, A to the next string. A, B, C, D, E to the next string. So they're based on fifth. So the lowest note that a violin can play is G, below middle C. The very highest is called C8. And C8 is the very top note on a piano. And it's several octaves above middle C. It's the highest note that can be produced by natural or artificial harmonics. You would almost never hear a C8 being played on a violin. Usually the highest note that you would, practical highest note on a violin would be 2 octaves above this, this E string. You might not know that there are different sizes of violins. Violins made for children, and so the size of the violin depends upon your arm length. So a child 3 to 5 years old with an arm length of 14 inches to 15.3 inches would play a 1/16 violin, which would be 15 inches tall. And you would go on, and they would change as they grow in their size to a larger violin, to where you get 11 plus years into the adults. Your arm length is 23.5 inches and up, and so you would play the largest violin, which is 23.25 inches. Now, I mentioned before that some of you may not like the violin, but you may like the fiddle. And so what is the difference between a violin and a fiddle? Look at these two. Which one is the violin and which one's the fiddle? You got it figured out? Okay, a fiddle is a generic term for any bowed string musical instrument, including the violin. The instruments themselves are identical. That's right. It's the style, the repertoire that is different. So according to the Cambridge Companion to the Violin, a fiddle is a violin that is used to play folk, country, or bluegrass music, as opposed to classical or jazz music. However, a fiddle can be used to play other styles of music as well, including Western swing, Middle Eastern, and Mediterranean music. The term violinist is used to distinguish between classically trained musicians that would play classical music, play jazz, or fiddlers who would play the local dance. Now, there can be some other differences as well. A fiddle can be made by Grandpa using a fence post and an old barn door. Again, fiddle is a generic name for a stringed bowed instrument. But a violin, you've got traditional materials, you've got accepted methods and proportions that they are made for. Fiddles can be adjusted different than violins. A fiddler may adjust to where the strings are lower height, so you'd have a flatter bridge that holds up the strings. You'd make the bridge flatter there. And fiddlers generally prefer louder strings, and also would make variations then of the 4-stringed traditional violin. Fiddlers would tell you, yeah, the violin sings, but the fiddle dances. So where did we come up with violins? Where did they come from? Well, the bowed stringed instruments began appearing in European carvings and drawings around 900 AD. The first, this is the lira of the Byzantine Empire. They spread westward through Europe. In the 11th and 12th centuries, European writers began using the word lira and fiddle interchangeably when referring to some bowed instruments. So this is a picture of a carving of a Byzantine ivory casket with a lira on it, and this is in a museum in Florence. Then there is the rebab. The rebab came out of Arabia, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, was introduced then into Western Europe, probably through the Iberian Empire. And these are rebabs that are in Turkey. Following centuries, Europe would continue to have 2 bowed type of instruments that developed. The viola da braccio, which means viola for arms, braccio being arms. The viola da gamba, which means viola for the leg. The viola da braccio would be the forerunner of the violin. The viola da gamba, it was important during the Renaissance, but eventually lost ground to the viola da braccio. Have no idea how you would play this instrument. Look at all the strings that it has in it, and I don't know whether you put it down at your leg and somehow play that. I don't know. Didn't get any information on that. Early 16th century, the violin. Pull that other. The violin emerged in northern Italy in the Brescia area. In 1530, the word violin began appearing in Brescian documents, and that spread throughout northern Italy. The first makers of the violins probably borrowed from these three different instruments. The rebec, which would have been derived from the Arabian rebab, the viola da braccio, and the lira da braccio. Now notice neither one of these instruments, none of the three instruments are played like the violin is today. In fact, this one is played more like the cello. This is closer maybe to the violin, but notice how this one is held here with the bottom of the violin up at the top. But by 1556, the violin had already spread across Europe, and from 1585 to 1595, the cradle of a school for string players and makers was in Brescia, in Italy. These people were called the Maestro of the various kinds of stringed instruments: the Viola da Gamba, the violon, the lira, the lirone, the violetta, the viola da braccio, and etc. But in 1630, there was a plague in Brescia, and it pretty well killed off all the violin makers, and so Cremona gained the influence among violins, and this is where the masters were from this time. Among the very start was Andrea Amati, who we don't have a picture of. He was an early famous luthier. A luthier is simply a lute builder. But he may have built the very first violin. That may have been ordered by the Medici family. They may have asked for an instrument that could be used by street musicians with the same quality that a lute would have. And so after making this, Andrea changed his profession from lute making to violin making, after seeing the popularity of those violins in Brescia also. And he made the world's oldest confirmed surviving violin in Cremona, possibly in 1558, and this is this violin, this Amati violin right here. Now the oldest violin that we have with a date inside is the Charles IX, and it was made in Corona in 1564. So you have a violin making families, starting with the Amati family, starting with Andrea Amati, who lived between 1500 and 1577, was followed by his sons, Antonio Amati and Hieronymus Amati. They were known as the Amati brothers. And then Hieronymus' son, Niccolo Amati, with a painting of him pictured here, is considered to have been the most noteworthy. And he was followed by his son, Hieronymus II. And so you had the Amati family from 1500 to 1740 for living that time. So for about 200 years, you had this family making violins all by hand. And you also had the Guarneri family. Andrea, between 1626 and 1698, and he became an apprentice in Niccolo Amati's shop. He was followed by his sons Pietro and Giuseppe, and then they were followed by Giuseppe's sons Pietro and Bartolomeo, and so from them from 1626 to 1744. Now Bartolomeo, the very last one I mentioned, would have been a rival to Stradivari. So that brings us to Antonio Stradivari. Stradivari was born in 1644 in Cremona. The actual date, we don't have the day of the year, but the actual year was determined by looking at some of the labels of his later violins. Died December 18th, 1737, at the ripe old age of either 92 or 93, depending upon the date of his birth. He was an Italian luthier. Luthier, again, is somebody who repairs lutes and other stringed instruments. Estimated that he made between 1,000 and 1,100 different instruments during his lifetime, making every one by hand. He made violins, but he also made other instruments. We know of 13 violas that he made, of 80 cellos, 2 guitars, 2 mandolins, lutes and harps. 630 to 650 of these instruments have survived today, including from 450 to 512 violins. Virtually none of the violins that we know of today are unaccounted for. He was from a notable citizen family. His ancestry had gone way back in Cremona to the 12th and 13th centuries. The earliest mention of the Stradivari family was in a land grant in 1188. The name Stradivari actually means toll man or open roads, so there may have been something dealing with his family on building of roads, or either that or maintaining the tolls on roads at one time. His parents were Alessandro Stradivari and Anna Moroni, and he had at least 3 brothers. He began making violins, we think, at the age of 12 to 14 as an apprentice to Niccolo Amati, or at least people think that he was an apprentice to Niccolo Amati. The oldest surviving violin that we have of Stradivarius was made in 1666, and the label reads, student of Niccolo Amati, made in the year of 1666. Now, Amati would have been a logical choice for Stradivari's parents to place their son as an apprentice because of the reputation they had as violin makers in Cremona. Now, there is an alternate theory that he did not study with Amati and was not apprenticed by Amati. According to this theory, some of his earlier violins bear less a resemblance to Amati than his later violins actually do. And so they surmise that he started as a woodworker. His first house was actually owned by a famous wood carver and inlayer. He may have been employed at some point to decorate some of Amati's instruments without being a true apprentice, and got interested in them that way. But assuming that he had an apprenticeship with the Amati family, he would have produced his first decent instrument in 1660 at the age of 16. The first labels were not printed until 1660 to 1665. He probably stayed in Amati's workshop, if he's a normal apprentice, until about 1684. July 4th of 1667, he married Francesca Ferraboschi. She was the widow of the burgher of Cremona, Giacomo Capra. They had had 2 children by him. Capra had actually been shot by Francesca's brother. And so she married Antonio Stradivari, and they moved into a house known as the Casa del Pescatore. And 3 or 4 months later, their first child was born. They later had 4 children, plus another infant son who died after only a week. By 1680, he had acquired a growing reputation, and he purchased this house at 1 Piazza Roma, just a few doors down from the Amatis and the Guarneri's. He probably worked in the loft, in the attic, and he lived there for the rest of his life. He was married to Francesca for about 31 years, and then Francesca died, and he gave her this elaborate 5-day funeral. But just a little over a year later, he married Isabella Costa, and they would have another 5 children. In 1682, he was commissioned by a Venetian banker for a complete set of instruments, and these were presented to King James II of England. We don't know what's happened to those today. Received a similar commission from Charles III of Spain. And then in 1684, Amati died, and he had a noticeable increase in production at that time as people began to go to Stradivari instead of to the Amati family. 4 different periods of production of Stradivari violins. There was that early career called the Amati's period. This is a period that he did some wide experimentation. The instruments are of less quality than his later work are. His precision, though, marked him as one of the most dexterous craftsmen in the world at the time. Then his second period was the early 1690s, and he departed from his earlier style and began to make violins with a larger pattern than those previous instruments. And these are called the long strads. Switched to a darker, richer varnish. Amati had used a yellowish varnish, and he used a darker one. The third period was after 1698. He abandoned the long strad, returned to the slightly shorter model, which he used until his death. 1700 to 1725 was the golden period. This is with a higher quality of violins than his early instruments were. This is where the most famous violins are. And here's two violins from the golden period, the 1715 Lipinski and the 1716 Messiah. The Lipinski is on loan to the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, and the Messiah was never sold, never given away. It remained with Stradivari until his death. It is on exhibit today at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. Toward the end of his years, 1725 to 1737, there was a fifth period. His instruments show signs of Stradivari's aging at the time. They're a bit less beautiful than the golden period, but they still do possess a fine tone. Stradivari died on December 18, 1737, at the age of 92 or 93. He's buried in the church of San Domenico in Cremona. So what makes a Stradivarius so special? Paul Barrett of the Halle Orchestra in Manchester, England says, each Strad is a character of its own. Each has a very strong personality that makes them something to deal with, rather like an old house that is very interesting but doesn't always do what you want. Arian Totis, who was editor of Strad magazine, said, if you compare it to an old Italian painting, the Strad is an incredible historical artifact that needs to be preserved. It's a work of art. Some thought, well, okay, the Strad sound comes because he made wood, used wood from ancient churches. But tree ring dating has proved that to be false. So some others say, well, he added a mystical ingredient to the wood. Or there was a special wood that he had. There's that spruce for the top that he used. That willow for the internal blocks and linings. He used willow there. He used, again, the maple for the backs and ribs and necks. Maybe it was the chemical treating that was designed to kill woodworm and fungi. And in 2006, U.S. researchers did find that there was some type of a chemical treating to kill off the fungi and the woodworm in the wood. This chemical is supposed to have been a mixture of borax, sodium, and potassium silicate. Maybe it was the varnish that used to stain his violins. And the varnish he used was called vernice bianca, and it's composed of gum arabic, honey, and egg white. A Texas violin maker and retired professor of chemistry had some other ideas.
Retired Texas A&M University chemistry professor Joseph Nochvari wanted to play the violin as a child, but World War II and the communist takeover of his native Hungary dashed that dream. Now, behind his home, he has a workshop where he makes his own violins, using methods including chemical treatments he thinks were used by the master violin makers in Italy 3 centuries ago. After examining violins across northern Italy, he found that only the instruments from Cremona and Venice had escaped damage from wood-eating worms.
But my conclusion was that in these 2 cities, someone treated the wood with preservatives.
As a chemist, Nochvari was intrigued and began testing various preservatives to see if they affected the sound of violins he made. His breakthrough came after collaborating with colleagues in the geology department at Texas A&M University. Geology professor Ray Gilmet utilized high technology in the form of a microprobe machine that tests the chemical makeup of a substance.
There are times when the machine is not in use on evenings or weekends, and I got permission from my department to use several hours of microprobe time to try to solve this very interesting problem.
He used tiny fragments of wood removed from Stradivari violins when they were being repaired, burned them to a white ash in a laboratory oven, and then tested the ash with the microprobe. The results showed chemicals such as sulfur, chlorine, and boron were present.
These are not present in any of the natural woods, and they show up as very distinct from the natural woods.
Such chemicals are commonly used as preservatives, and this bolstered Professor Nocivari's theory that chemical treatments of the wood had inadvertently produced a better instrument. While many musicians welcomed his research, Nocivari says collectors and dealers in antique instruments were not pleased.
It's easier to sell a Stradivari violin for $5 million when you say it's a product of some sort of mysterious divine inspiration.
While his research has been praised internationally, he says the music world is not so enthused.
I could say that with one or two exceptions, almost the entire industry was very negative, very antagonistic to a scientist wanting to do this kind of research.
But Nocivari has found enthusiastic support from many violinists, like University of Texas at Austin music professor Brian Lewis, who tested one of Nocivari's violins.
Hey, it's got a nice sound. I like it.
But Lewis cannot say this new Texas violin is as good as a Stradivarius simply because an instrument needs to be played for many years to develop its full potential.
It would be a really great thing to compare what one of his violins sounds like after 30,000 hours of playing, because all of those strats have been, quote-unquote, played in.
The violins of Joseph Nocivari and other violin makers using his technique may someday attain the excellent tone of the Stradivarius, showing that great music can come from chemistry. Greg Flakus, VOA News, College Station, Texas.
Another idea is that he used techniques that have been lost. Some say it was just pure genius on Stradivarius' part in his being able to make it. Maybe it was the structure of the Stradivarius. He used a flatter shape. The shape of his plates were different, were a little bit flatter. You see, the challenge to Stradivari was to produce an instrument with expressive sound and the volume needed to fill out the large concert halls. Now, prior to the period where Stradivari was living in, performances were generally confined to small venues, private parties, etc. But now these big concert halls were beginning to open up. And no, they didn't have electricity, they didn't have the microphones system that we have today. And so you had the challenge to make an instrument that would produce a lot of sound. Some say, well, maybe this wonderful sound is because of the reduced solar activity in the 17th century. This is out of a study by Columbia and Tennessee universities in 2003. The winters were colder and the summers were cooler also in 1645 to 1750. There was a reduction in sunspots, and this produced slower tree growth, and that therefore resulted in a denser wood with superior acoustical properties. And those circumstances, by the way, have not been repeated since that time. And that theory has been proved out by tree ring dating. Some say, well, maybe it's the special wood that was used, and maybe they've imported wood from Croatia instead of what they had in the area. And that wood, again, was known for its extreme density, harsher Croatian winters during this time period especially. And we do know that Croatian wood was traded by Venetian merchants of the era. And sometimes, even today, this Croatian wood is used by local luthiers and craftsfolks for musical instruments. Maybe it was the touch of the master's hand. 'Twas battered and scarred, and the auctioneer thought it hardly worth his while to waste his time on the old violin, but he held it up with a smile. "What am I bid, good people?" he cried. "Who starts the bidding for me? $1, $1, do I hear two? $2, who'll make it $3? $3 once, $3 twice, going $3, going for $3. But no, from the room far back, a gray, bearded man came forward and picked up the bow, then wiped the dust from the old violin, and tightening up the strings, he played a melody, pure and sweet as the angel sings. The music ceased, and the auctioneer, with a voice that was quiet and low, says, "What now am I bid for this old violin?" as he held it aloft with its bow. 1,000, 1,000, do I hear 2? 2,000, who'll make it 3? 3,000 once, 3,000 twice, going and gone, said he. The audience cheered, but some of them cried, "We just don't understand." What changed its worth? Swift came the reply, the touch of the master's hand. And many a man with life out of tune, all battered with bourbon and gin, is auctioned cheap to a thoughtless crowd, much like that old violin. A mess of pottage, a glass of wine, a game, and he travels on. He's going once, he's going twice, he's going and almost gone. But the master comes, and the foolish crowd never can quite understand the worth of a soul and the change that is wrought by the touch of this master's hand. So possibly as in violins of old, violins of new, what produces that sound, what produces that special effect, it's the touch of the master's hand, the touch of the violinist. In 2011, there was a blind study done. This was done at the 8th International Violin Competition in Indianapolis. And it was handled by Joseph Curtin, who was a violin maker, and Claudia Fritz, who was a scientist who studied instrument acoustics. Now, Fritz says many people were convinced that as soon as you play an old violin, you can feel that it's old. It's been played a lot, and it has a special sound quality. People who took part in the experiment said it was the experience of a lifetime when we told them the results. They were fully convinced they could tell the difference. And they couldn't. So they picked 6 violins, 2 Stradivarius, 1 Guarneri. These were worth a combined total of $10 million. And then they chose 3 new violins. These were a combined value of several hundred times less than the Strads and the Guarneri. They put dabs of perfume on the chin rest so that it would block out any distinctive smells of an older wood. They chose 21 professional violinists. These were ranged from anywhere from 15 years old to 61 years old. Some were contestants and some were judges in the competition. The players wore goggles so they couldn't see properly. Test 1. They played in a dimly lit room, and it was chosen for relatively dry acoustics. Neither the players nor the people who gave them the violins knew which instrument was which. So each player played a random pair of violins. They would play them for a minute and say which one that they preferred. They did not know which one was old and which one was new. The players generally chose equally between the old and the new. Well, except for one Strad. One Stradivarius, the one who had the most illustrious history. No, it wasn't the most chosen. It was the one that was least chosen, least liked of the violins. Far lesser than the new violins. Test 2, the players were able to see all 6 violins. They were laid out in random order on a bed, and they had 20 minutes to play any violin against another. So they could choose 2 violins and play it, and they had a total of 20 minutes. And then they would choose one to say, okay, which one would I like to take home if I had the ability to take one home? They were also asked to pick the best and worst in terms of the range of tone colors, their projection, their playability, and their response. The players chose, overall, one of the new violins as both the take-home instruments and the top ranking of the 4 qualities. Only 38%, 8 of the 21 players, chose to take an old violin home. Most could not tell which one was old and which was new. Of course, their factors could have affected the study, the acoustics in the room, the lighting in the room, the small sample size, but still, it's interesting. The study, by the way, agrees with other blind tests that have been done from 1871 to 2012. Music commentator Miles Hoffman says, what's interesting about playing a Strad, about playing any great old Italian instrument, is under the ear. There's a sweetness to it. There's a depth of sound. And also you have a sense that no matter how much sound is coming out of the instrument, somehow or other, there's always more. The joy of owning and playing a Stradivarius comes not from an objective advantage in its sound, but simply from the knowledge that it's a Stradivarius. Never mind what it sounds like. It's an elegant and beautifully made instrument that carries status in its name, gravitas in its price tag, and the weight of centuries in its wood. So, enough of me. I'll let you close out by hearing the sounds of the Stradivarius as played by Satu Vanska, the assistant leader of the Australian Chamber Orchestra. Good day, and make music today.